Today I'll be going over Chapter 6 of Nancy Rook's book, Inside Graceland. Chapter 6 is titled, Lord, Please Save My Boy. Now, this chapter does discuss the end of Elvis's life, just so you know. Nancy says August 16th, 1977 began like any other hot summer day in Memphis. Elvis was preparing to leave for another demanding concert tour, and the activity around Graceland was increasing as everyone got ready for it. Elvis's concerts had become so large and complicated that preparing for a tour required many hours and days of planning and coordination before everyone's departure. Nancy writes, Elvis was a musical superstar. Though he had gained weight and some fans were complaining, lost some of his enthusiasm, he was still adored by his numerous fans, and his concerts were still blockbuster and usually sold out events. His own generation never gave up on him, and there were now legions of new fans that had come to appreciate his unparalleled, legendary onstage performances. Nancy says while the domestic staff mostly continued their normal duties during the tour preparations, they could still feel the tension and pressure surrounding Elvis and the guys. The tours required enormous amounts of time and money and effort to organize, which made the atmosphere around Graceland noticeably stressful. Nancy arrived at Graceland early that day around 6 a.m., and the weather was already hot and humid. Light showers that morning failed to ease the heat. When she walked into the house, Pauline told her that Elvis was in the racquetball court out back playing with Ginger, his cousin Billy, and Billy's wife Jo. Nancy believes it was about 6:30 a.m. when Elvis, Ginger, and Billy walked back into the house, and Elvis looked sweaty. She asked him, Mr. Elvis, can I fix you something to eat? He told her, no thanks, Nancy. I'm not hungry right now, but I'm really thirsty and would really like some ice water, and then all I want to do is get some sleep. Elvis, Ginger, and Billy walked upstairs up the back stairway, and Pauline would bring up his ice water after Nancy poured it. When Pauline came back downstairs, she mentioned to Nancy that Elvis seemed off. Pauline said, he practically grabbed the water out of my hand. Nancy says that was very uncharacteristic for Elvis, but she didn't put much more thought into it. A maid who was supposed to be there that day didn't show up, so Aunt Delta said she'd help with the house cleaning. But since she didn't like to cook, Nancy knew she'd be doing most of the work that day. Nancy cleaned Dodger's room, and Aunt Delta worked on the den and the living room. Then Nancy fixed Dodger's lunch, and the two had a cup of coffee together before Dodger went back to her bedroom. Before leaving for the day that morning, Pauline told her that Elvis had a restless night, which was common before a tour. The night before, he and Ginger had ridden his motorcycle around the streets near Graceland, trying to relax and ease the stress of the upcoming tour. Nancy says it wasn't uncommon for Elvis to go out riding for hours at night. He loved doing it, and she believes it was the only time he could get out. He could get out of the house and not be mobbed by fans on the street. Okay, so here is Nancy's timeline of events according to her book. Elvis and Ginger returned to Graceland around 10 p.m., and he had planned to rent out a local theater to watch a movie, which she believes to be MacArthur. But for reasons unknown to her, it didn't work out. Nancy says Ricky went to Pizza Hut down the street and brought back spaghetti and meatballs for everyone, but she isn't sure if Elvis ate any of it. Around 10:30 p.m., Elvis and Ginger went to see his dentist for routine dental work and then returned back to Graceland an hour later. Nancy writes, I heard from one of the other staff members, I don't remember who, that Elvis was not in a good mood for several reasons. We all knew that he was worried about the new book that had just been released a few weeks earlier, the book written by his former bodyguards. This upcoming tour was to be the first time he would be facing his fans after the book had come out, and he was concerned about how his fans would react to it when he walked on stage. In addition to the frustration of not being able to get the movies rented the night before, which he had been looking forward to, he and Ginger were also spatting back and forth about various things. Mary Jenkins had walked in on them the night before, finding them sitting in the dark in Lisa's room arguing, as she put it, rather forcefully, about whether she was going to accompany him on the tour the next day. So things had not been going well for Elvis that Monday night. That's when they decided to go play racquetball, which Nancy believes they did to try to calm Elvis down. After coming in from racquetball and retreating upstairs, Nancy didn't hear from Elvis, but she does remember Ricky and then Aunt Delta going upstairs to deliver Elvis's medications throughout the morning. Nancy says these medications for Elvis was not unusual because he had long struggled with health issues, including severe insomnia. Like many people in high-stress careers, he often found it very difficult to fall asleep. With the guidance of his doctors, Elvis had developed a routine of taking medications before trying to sleep, And over time, the medications had to become stronger as his tolerance increased. And she says Elvis also suffered from a variety of medical issues, which left him in terrible pain at times. Nancy writes, people have asked me over the years if I had seen how bad the prescription use had become. As I look back on it, the only thing I can remember is watching him in pain a lot of the time and seeing him feeling the tremendous stresses of keeping up with the schedule that would have been impossible for most people to tolerate. And I think it just became normal to see him trying to do things to accommodate that demand. So Nancy doesn't detail what specific medical ailments that would leave Elvis in terrible pain. Nancy continues, it's not that so many of us were not concerned for him. It's just that it became so routine. Looking back on it, I remember Aunt Delta telling me just several months before, as we stood up by the racquetball court one morning, that she was afraid that if he doesn't stop taking so many drugs, I'm afraid he's going to die. But even so, she continued to take him whatever medications he would ask for. We just all wanted to try and make his life as comfortable for him as we could. As such, it didn't seem out of place when Elvis's medications were taken to him that fateful Tuesday morning. To them, it was as normal as any given person taking an aspirin for a headache. Nancy says she doesn't remember who all was in the house that morning, but she believes Ricky was asleep in the pool room, Charlie was in his room, and Dodger was in hers. She saw Al Strada taking containers of Elvis's wardrobes in the jungle room, and Joe was in the back office behind the house. Nancy was sitting at the kitchen counter on her break watching what she believes was the soap opera. As the world turns, then the intercom phone from Elvis's room rang. Nancy writes, I picked up the phone expecting to hear Elvis's voice, still half asleep, wanting to order his usual breakfast. Instead, I heard Ginger's voice, and she sounded breathless and very worried, like I had never heard her before. At first, she asked if Ricky, Al, or any of the other bodyguards were close by. I told her that I was the only one in the kitchen area, that Aunt Delta had taken off for Lowenstein's department store to buy some last-minute items for Elvis, and Al had gone to Walgreens, but I was expecting him back most any minute. She says Ginger began sobbing and said, something is terribly wrong with Elvis. Nancy tried to calm her down, but as Ginger continued talking, she became increasingly upset and hysterical and eventually became so distraught that Nancy couldn't understand her. Nancy says her immediate reaction was to rush upstairs to find out what was wrong. After hanging up the phone, she ran quickly up the back staircase, and seeing that the padded black doors to Elvis's bedroom were closed, she continued past them. She turned down the hallway and entered the open doorway to his dressing room. She didn't see anything unusual, so slowly she moved through the dressing room and toward his bathroom. Her heart was pounding as she entered because she knew that Elvis's room was his private sanctuary, and everyone in the house normally respected it. In fact, the doors were never locked upstairs because Elvis knew no one would dare walk in unless they were invited. Nancy quietly said, Mr. Elvis, are you okay? Is everything all right? There was no answer. She crept closer to the bathroom door until she could actually see inside. Nancy writes, my heart sank as I saw him. I had not actually entered the bathroom itself, but could see his reflection in a mirror mounted along the wall leading into the room. He was lying on the floor with his face buried in the thick red shag bathroom carpet. It appeared that he had been sitting on the commode and had apparently tried to stand up, taken a few steps, and then fallen forward onto the carpet. His pajama bottoms were down around his ankles, and I could see his bare behind pointing slightly up into the air. My first thought was pure panic. I think I instinctively knew he was dead, but it was such a shock finding him like that. Here was the world's most famous entertainer in such an unflattering and embarrassing position. I knew I had to get help. Nancy turned to head back downstairs and noticed that the door to Elvis's bedroom, where Ginger was closed enough so that it blocked her view into it. Panicking and not knowing first aid, she decided the best thing to do was to get help. Even in the urgency of that moment, she still felt uneasy being upstairs without being called by Elvis. It was out of habit and respect for his privacy. Nancy ran downstairs and was immensely relieved to see Al Strada walk in the back door. He could tell by her eyes that something was wrong. Nancy screamed to him that he needed to go upstairs and check on Elvis, who was lying unresponsive on the bathroom floor, and Al flew up the stairs 2 at a time. He immediately came back downstairs and, breathless, told her he needed help and Elvis was in serious trouble. Nancy screamed, "Do something, Al, do something," Nancy writes. At about that time, Joe Esposito came running into the house. He may have been back in Vernon's office, and Ginger had apparently called back there for help after I'd spoken with her. Joe and Al ran back upstairs, and then shortly, Vernon came through the door with his niece Patsy, literally helping to support him. They were both visibly shaking. Vernon, having been through several recent heart attacks, was not in good health himself, and as the two came through the patio door, they were holding hands, and Vernon was crying. He kept repeating, "Lord, save him! Lord, please save my boy!" Slowly, with Patsy's help, the two of them disappeared up the stairs. Then Charlie walked into the kitchen, unaware of what was happening upstairs, and headed for the coffee pot. When he saw Vernon shaking and upset, he thought someone had played a practical joke on him and began making fun of him. Nancy shouted at him, "Charlie, this is no joke. Something is wrong with Mr. Elvis." Realizing how serious the matter was, his face went white and he ran upstairs. Nancy later heard from someone that Charlie was getting ready to try and give Elvis CPR, but that everyone agreed it was too late for that. Nancy writes, "Even though most everyone seemed to sense that Elvis was already dead, we all still tried to hold on to some small glimmer of hope that he might pull out of this if we could just get him to the hospital. Trying to keep my emotions in check, I stayed downstairs for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for the medical team to arrive. I watched the small television monitor above the kitchen counter until I saw the ambulance pull through the lower gates and head up the circular driveway in front of the house. Nancy opened the front door and met the two medics. She told them, 'Put the stretcher over your heads, go up the stairs and make a sharp turn to the right. Then go through the doorway and listen for the commotion in the front part of the house.'" She later learned that one of the paramedics who responded that day would also later transport Vernon to the hospital and later transported Dodger's body after her death. Nancy was waiting downstairs for what felt like a long time, not wanting to intrude on what was happening upstairs. She thought they would call for her if she was needed. She writes, "Elvis was my boss, but he was much more than that. He was also like a brother to me, as well as a good friend, and the thought of losing him was almost more than I could bear. At the same time, however, I am proud as I look back on that day that I was able to keep my head and do what needed to be done. By this point, I had the sinking feeling that all of us had done everything we could for Elvis. The rest was in God's hands." But she and everyone else in the house still held on to hope that Elvis would recover, since he had been ill many times before and had always pulled through. After about 15 minutes, they carried Elvis down the stairs on a stretcher, which she says was, quote, "not an easy task due to his weight and the tight space at the top of the stairs." She saw Elvis carried down into the foyer, and he was wearing a blue pajama top that was unbuttoned, and he had a thin blue sheet covering him up to his chest. When she got a glimpse of his face, she wanted to turn away. Nancy writes, "Strangely, on the one hand, he looked sort of like he was sleeping. On the other hand, however, his face was blue and very distorted looking, and not a single muscle in his body was moving, and he did not appear to be breathing. As I look back on it, I think I knew then in my heart that he was gone." She was feeling overwhelming pain in that moment, as if all the life had drained out of Graceland, leaving the realization that nothing in the house would ever be the same again. As Elvis was carried to the ambulance parked facing the meditation garden, Al and Joe climbed in with the paramedic as they rushed him to the hospital, and the other guys ran to cars so that they could follow the ambulance. Dr. Nick drove up just as the ambulance was about to leave, and he jumped in the back of it too. Then the ambulance sped off, making a right at the gate to head to the hospital. Nancy says all she could hear then was the siren of the ambulance and her heart racing wildly. Nancy writes, "Vernon did not seem to have the strength or the will to accompany his son to the hospital. I think that he, like the rest of us, was slowly giving up all hope that he would see his son alive again. Sometime after we had all gone back inside the house, Ginger was walking down the stairs crying. When we saw her coming down, she was completely dressed and had her makeup on. Vernon and I were both at the bottom of the stairs, and Vernon asked her what had happened." So in Lisa Marie's book, she remembers how she saw Ginger was somehow dressed to the nines. And in Ginger's book, she says that she simply just put on the same clothes that she had worn the night before. Nancy writes, "Ginger told us that she had fallen asleep early, but Elvis was very restless and had gotten up to go into the bathroom to read. When she woke up several hours later, Tuesday afternoon, Elvis was not in the bed. She said she called out for him, and not getting a response, got up and walked toward the bathroom. Looking at the opening at the bottom of the bathroom door, Ginger said she saw that the light was on and decided that Elvis was still in there reading. She said she knocked on the door several times and, still not getting a response, opened the door leading into the bathroom. It was then that she saw Elvis lying on the bathroom floor. She said that was when she ran into the bedroom and called me on the intercom phone." Nancy asked, Ginger, why did it take you so long to check on him? Sobbing, Ginger replied, I don't know. I was sleeping and couldn't wake up. Interesting, she didn't mention the narcotics she took. Nancy says Ginger and Vernon were, quote, not on the best of terms, and that Vernon thought Ginger didn't have Elvis's best interest at heart, and some of the other employees shared the same sentiment. Nancy writes, Ginger and I had lunch several months after Elvis died, and I came away with a more sympathetic view of her. I think she has been unjustly accused in some ways and somewhat misunderstood in the events of that day. There was probably nothing that she could have done to prevent his death any more than the rest of us could, and any more than the rest of us could not have done anything to have saved him. Elvis was a strong personality and was used to having his way. Ginger was very young at the time. I sometimes have thought she may have been in way over her head in her relationship with him at such a young age. So Ginger doesn't mention this lunch with Nancy in her book, which is very interesting because in her book, she says that she felt largely abandoned after Elvis had passed, largely abandoned by Elvis's family and his circle. So you would think that she would mention this lunch with Nancy. The only time she mentions Nancy in my recollection after Elvis has passed in her book is when she and her mom were at the courthouse. I think she was there for her deposition in Dr. Nick's investigation. And she runs into Nancy in the bathroom, and Nancy mentions that there was possibly a third packet that was delivered to Elvis that morning. Anyway, Nancy says the day Elvis passed, Vernon took charge. Nancy writes, later that day, as I was standing again at the bottom of the stairs, Vernon was walking by as Ginger was coming down the stairs. I heard Vernon tell Ginger, you'll have to leave now. You're not welcome in this house anymore. Now, crying even more, Ginger ran back upstairs, collected her things, and rushed past me and Vernon, left through the back door and drove off. I watched as she drove out the back through the side entrance. Unlike Linda Thompson, who kept personal belongings at Graceland, Ginger usually arrived with only a small white overnight bag when she stayed the night, and she never, quote, moved in. Nancy doesn't ever remember even washing any of Ginger's laundry the way she had done with plenty of other women. Nancy writes, a lot of people have asked me if Elvis had really intended to marry Ginger. I don't think that he did. I think in the beginning he felt like he could change her into someone who could take care of him. But as time went on, I think he realized that he could not mold her like he wanted to. She was just too young and too independent. He had already mentioned to me a day or so earlier that if she did not go with him on this tour, he was going to find someone else. Elvis said, I have spent over $60,000 on her and she still won't do what I want her to do. Elvis eventually realized Ginger was still seeing another man. Nancy says Elvis had Ginger secretly followed after telling him she was going home, only for her to end up at an East Memphis nightclub. Nancy writes, I personally had called her house at Elvis's request several times after she would leave Graceland telling Elvis she was going home, only to be told by someone at her house hours later that she wasn't there. I think he had reached the end of his rope with her. Even so, I felt sorry for her, as she was now being told to leave by Vernon, but I think she probably knew it was coming. When Ginger left Graceland that day, she took all of her things, already packed, in that small white bag, and to the surprise of many, Vernon allowed her back 2 days later for the funeral. After Elvis was taken away in the ambulance, Aunt Delta, Vernon, Patsy, and a few others gathered in Dodger's room where they cried and tried to console one another. Dodger stayed in her room during the commotion and was told that Elvis had not been breathing when he was taken away. Too frail to go upstairs, she remained in her rocking chair in a state of grief and anxiously waiting for updates from the others. Aunt Delta remained more composed than the others. She recognized that immediate steps had to be taken while still focused on protecting Elvis. The ambulance was barely out of the driveway when Aunt Delta grabbed Nancy by the arm and said, Let's go. We've got to go upstairs and get rid of some things before the investigators get here. Nancy had no idea what Aunt Delta was talking about, but followed her up to Elvis's bathroom. There, Aunt Delta explained they needed to remove any medications and needles in case Elvis died, and the police came to investigate. It would look bad if any of those things were discovered in Elvis's bathroom or bedroom. Nancy writes, I didn't think anything about it being illegal. I was just doing as I was told to do by Aunt Delta. I was still trying to grasp what had just happened, not really allowing myself to even think that Elvis could be dead. It was just too inconceivable for me to even think such a thought. I think in the state of mind and fear that I was experiencing, she could have asked me to do just about anything and I would have at least attempted to do it out of the sense of shock that I was feeling at that time. Nancy grabbed a trash can, which they always lined with plastic bags. She removed the plastic bag from the bin and began filling it with all the containers, pill bottles, aspirin, and even a few syringes from all around the bathroom. They hurriedly searched the bathroom and bedroom, emptying counters, drawers, and cabinets to remove everything, both of them anxious as they worked to make sure nothing was left behind. Nancy says, "Apparently, we didn't do the best job in the world. Several needles were later found by the investigators." She never questioned Aunt Delta or if what they were doing was wrong. She just did what Aunt Delta told her to do. "Throw this away, throw that away, grab that, pick that one up, get that one off the counter." Then they changed the sheets and covers on Elvis's bed and replaced all the towels in the bathroom. Aunt Delta also wanted to check under the bed, but it was too dark under there, and Nancy wasn't about to go sticking her hand blindly in there, so they abandoned that idea. Nancy writes, "Looking back on what we did, I know that Aunt Delta was trying to protect Elvis. All of what I picked up had prescription labels attached, so I know they were all legal drugs. Whether Elvis should have been taking so many different prescriptions is probably another matter altogether. But then again, Elvis was Elvis, and it was not our job, nor was it possible for us to protect him from himself." When the two walked back downstairs, Aunt Delta took both plastic bags and threw them away in the main trash container in the backyard. Nancy would learn later that while life-saving attempts were made on Elvis upstairs, someone collected a number of needles and pill bottles and eventually buried them under a tree in the backyard. As Nancy tried to calm herself, she suddenly realized she hadn't seen Lisa during the chaos and began worrying about how the young girl was coping with what was happening. She found Lisa upstairs in her bedroom with the door closed. She was in there with a cousin and a friend. Nancy could hear Lisa quietly crying. Nancy knocked on the door and said, "Lisa, please come out, baby. I need to talk to you." Lisa's little frightened voice replied, "No, I don't want to come out. It's my daddy, isn't it?" Nancy didn't know how to approach the topic, but she wanted to be honest. "Yes, baby, it is, but I can't tell you anything right now. You need to come downstairs with me." After a few minutes, Lisa finally opened the door. Sobbing, she ran into Nancy's arms, and they stood there hugging for a few minutes before Nancy put her arm around her shoulder and they walked downstairs into the kitchen. Nancy writes, "I felt it would be better for her to be around people like her grandmother, Aunt Delta, and Vernon, until we could find out what was going on. She did cheer up somewhat being around them and eventually went outside and rode around the grounds on her golf cart." Dr. Nick returned to Graceland with 2 paramedics to deliver the news that no one wanted to hear. The 2 paramedics came along in case Vernon collapsed when he heard the news. Dr. Nick went into Dodger's room to break the news to the family. In the meantime, Nancy served the 2 medics lemonade at the dining room table. In Dodger's room, Dr. Nick told the family members that he was sorry, but Elvis had died. He repeatedly said sorry in what Nancy believes was an attempt to soften the devastating news. Nancy writes, "But it didn't work. After his announcement, chaos immediately erupted throughout the house. Everyone started crying and screaming, and some even ran from room to room like they were trying to find some comfort by going to another place. I remember Vernon slumped in a chair in the hallway, his left arm propped for support on the table. He was crying out, 'My baby is gone, my baby is gone.' He looked so frail and so lost. My heart was grieving for him, and yet I knew there was nothing anyone could say or do at that time to comfort him." She says she'll never forget that day and the enormous sadness that was in it. Everyone dealt with their grief in their own way, and it took a while before things settled down. She believes many of them just cried until they couldn't cry anymore. Once the news of Elvis's death broke around 3:30 p.m., the phones at Graceland began ringing nonstop with calls from across Memphis, the country, and eventually the world. The phone system actually shut down completely. Elvis was gone, and those close to him had to set aside their grief so the world could say goodbye. In the days that followed, condolences poured in from across the entertainment world, governments, and even the president. The mourning and sympathy all centered around Graceland, which had become like a second home to Nancy in the last 10 years. She says that the most heartfelt tributes came from Elvis's fans as tens of thousands gathered and countless flowers arrived in Memphis to honor a star whose life ended far too soon. She believes Elvis would have been deeply moved by the outpouring of love from fans, and she believes that there would never be another like him. Despite their shock and grief, life had to continue, and they had to begin planning Elvis's funeral while preparing Graceland to receive the mourners. Nancy writes, "We also had to remember that little Lisa Marie now demanded our immediate attention. As bad as it was for the rest of us, she had just lost her father, and her mother was halfway across the country in Los Angeles. It must have been a terrifying ordeal for her at that time. She was old enough to know something terribly bad had just happened to her father, but at the same time, she was too young to be able to fully comprehend its magnitude. And those of us around her weren't able to offer her much understanding because we were as shocked as she was at what had just happened. Nancy thinks that Lisa may not have heard the announcement of Elvis's death. She was possibly outside riding her small blue golf cart around the grounds at that time and unaware of the full meaning of what was happening. At one point, Lisa came into the house and saw everyone in tears and began running from room to room, crying and jumping around. Nancy writes, after what seemed like an eternity, she was able to settle down somewhat. She went into Dodger's room and called Linda Thompson, dialing the memorized number herself, and told Linda that Elvis had died. That was how Linda found out that her former lover was dead. Nancy often wondered what Lisa remembered about that day, feeling heartbroken for her and wishing they could return to the happier times they once shared. A flood of memories returned to Nancy. All the happy moments she had shared with Lisa in the house that had become such an important part of her life. She couldn't dwell on it too long, though. They had a funeral to prepare. That's the end of chapter 6. Stay tuned for chapter 7, which is titled The Next Day. See you then.